Principles of Economics, my complete guide to understanding economics, is now available in hardcover, audiobook, and ebook from Saifedean.com, Amazon, and many more booksellers worldwide. And now I am also teaching a course based on this book on my website, Saifedean.com. Principles of Economics will run the whole academic year, from September to June, and will have a new lecture every 2 weeks, as well as weekly live online discussion seminars open to learners from all over the world and from all walks of life. Whether you're a student, a professional, or a retiree, you are making economic decisions every day, and this course will arm you with the wisdom of centuries of economists to improve your economic decision-making. You'll also get a free book of Principles of Economics if you sign up for the course. Go to Saifedean.com and sign up now. The Bitcoin Standard podcast is brought to you by Crowd Health. Crowd Health is the Bitcoiners' answer to fiat health insurance. If you listen to the show, you've probably heard me rail against the problems of modern healthcare and health insurance. Crowd Health is a brilliant new solution to this problem that leverages the power of Bitcoin to help people get affordable healthcare. Crowd Health holds its cash reserves in Bitcoin. It negotiates with healthcare providers on your behalf and gets you much better rates by offering to pay them cash, upfront, without having to go through the expensive bureaucracy of modern healthcare insurance. It's a solution that works better for healthcare providers and for patients by disintermediating large insurance companies who have the wrong incentives and are constantly raising costs. I'm very happy to have signed up for Crowd Health, and I'm really excited to support them as they disrupt the fiat health insurance industry. Go to joincrowdhealth.com and use the discount code SAIF, S-A-I-F, and you'll get the first 6 months for $99 only. This podcast is also brought to you by the Bitcoin Way, your professional Bitcoin IT team offering you personalized, secure, and comprehensive solutions for every step along your Bitcoin journey. The Bitcoin Way offer live concierge service to guide you with your Bitcoin cold storage, running your node, privacy best practices, inheritance planning, corporate strategy, and multi-sig solutions. They don't touch your coins, they guide you through the process of acquiring your coins and securing them. If you'd like to make your setup safer and more reliable, book a consult with them and see what they have to suggest. If you want to give someone the gift of Bitcoin, get them this professional service that will ensure they start off knowing exactly how to manage their coins and not lose them. Go to thebitcoinway.com and start Bitcoining more confidently. Hello, welcome to another episode of the Bitcoin Standard podcast. Our guest today is Sheldon Richman. Sheldon is the executive director of the Libertarian Institute. He's formerly worked for the Foundation for Economic Education, edited The Free Man for 15 years. He's also worked at the Cato Institute, the Institute for Humane Studies, and the Council for a Competitive Economy. Mr. Richman has also freelanced for many publications, including the Washington Report on the Middle East Affairs. He's written 6 books, including Coming to Palestine, which we are going to be discussing today, What Social Animals Owe to Each Other, America's Counter-Revolution, The Constitution Revisited, Separating School and State, another common topic that we have on this show, Your Money or Your Life, Why We Must Abolish the Income Tax, and Tethered Citizens, Time to Repeal the Welfare State. Sheldon, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
So I've followed your work for quite a while. We've corresponded for a bit, and I enjoyed your perspective on the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. I think we find ourselves in a lot of agreement. If anybody's tuning in for fireworks and fights and acrimony, I'm unfortunately going to disappoint you today. This is going to be a lot more measured because we agree, also maybe because we are libertarians and we are capable of having civilized conversations. So even when I had Walter Block on, it was civilized and it wasn't a very acrimonious. I wanted to discuss your perspective on the Palestinian question as a libertarian and as an American and as a Jewish person who's been to Palestine and has changed his perspective over the years on this question. So why don't we begin, first of all, with your background, how you became a libertarian, why you became a libertarian, and then what made you interested in Palestine and Israel?
Well, I was, like a lot of people, I was a libertarian before I ever heard the word. I was born at the end of the 1940s, give you a little bit of a dating of myself there. And so I grew up in the 50s and the early 60s, still, coming of age. And and I'd heard stories, read stories, had seen movies on, and things on TV about the American Revolution, and always was favorably disposed to that to the, the version of that story we all have about individual liberty. That always appealed to me from the moment that I had any political awareness. I was pro-liberty. In those days, that sort of meant you were a conservative. That's the way it was presented. So I thought of myself as a conservative. I'd never heard the word libertarian. And I joined, I was getting late in high school, began to, freshman in college, joined the Young Americans for Freedom, which was an organization set up by William F. Buckley and that movement, the conservative movement. But very quickly began to realize and met people, began to realize there was a big division in what at that point was called the conservative movement. You had what were called the trads, the traditionalists, and the libertarians. And we had this big showdown convention in 1969 in St. Louis, Missouri, where I was there, where the libertarians got defeated. We tried to elect people to the national board. We got defeated by a lot of other people who were shouting laissez-faire. That's a play on laissez-faire. This was the conservatives. Laissez-faire, laissez-faire. And of course, we got beaten pretty badly. And we thought, there's no future for us in this organization. So we left. And the core of the people that broke off were in Philadelphia, where I was, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And we set up the Society for Individual Liberty, which grew. And, we were urged on by Murray Rothbard and other libertarians who were already kind of a little ahead of us and realized that there was no place for us in the conservative movement, which we understood. We had differences on foreign policy. We had lots of differences on domestic policy. I mean, they claimed they were for the free market, but the conservatives violated that all over the place. They were more interested in tradition and stuff like that. So that's how all that began. I grew up in a Jewish family, conservative Jewish, not Orthodox, not Reform. But by the end of the 60s, I was already a completely secular person. I had given up all religion. I just became convinced that I don't believe it has a basis in fact or reality. However, I was still kind of pro-Israel. I mean, I grew up at the version of Israel. I mean, we went to Hebrew school, and a large part of Hebrew school as a kid was teaching an affection for Israel. Dare I say dual loyalty? I mean, in my classroom and in the synagogue, there were two national flags that were on, flagpoles inside. The American flag, of course, and the Israeli flag. There was no Japanese flag or Lebanese flag. There were no other flags. Two flags only. So part of that was to teach us to grow up to be, if we didn't move there ourselves, at least send a lot of money and be loyal to Israel, along with the United States. It wasn't a conflict. It was presented as kind of a unity. So that took a few more years after I realized I was a non-believer, a non-religious person. It took a few more years to give up the other part of it, because the thing is, these days, not just these days, but for the last many decades, what makes a person a good Jewish American or Westerner is not that you believe in God, not that you keep kosher, not that you do any of those things, but that you were pro-Israel. And this actually was predicted in the early days, I'm talking about the late 19th century, by Reform Jews and even Orthodox Jews who thought if they do get in Israel, if the Zionist movement succeeds, it's going to distort the religion. It's going to become a form of idolatry, where instead of making God and Torah the center, this state will be the center. And I have to say, they were prophetic. Those predictions came true. So that's kind of in a nutshell there, my story.
Yes, and so you were still a Zionist up until at what point would you say? Is this the 1970s?
In the 70s, I met someone who said, I had assumed there was a sort of a libertarian story, very much like Bloch told you and in his writings, that land was bought, land was acquired. I didn't believe it in biblical terms, but the land was legitimately purchased, and that seems why is that not consistent with libertarianism? An old friend of mine who died many years ago said, "Well, it's not really quite like that," and he recommended that I read David Hirst's book, "The Gun and the Olive Branch." Hirst is a British, they're still around, a British journalist. His book is a pretty thick book. It's gone through about 3 editions. Very fair. I mean, he gives both sides, or all sides, if there's more than 2 sides, a fair shot. And see, he said, you ought to read this book. So I read, and I began to read, and I began to read other things as well. And I realized it's not a libertarian story. There was dispossession, going back, certainly in the 20th century, there was a problem with the Balfour Declaration and all of that stuff. So that the libertarian story fell apart. I think Bloch's case is ridiculous. And of course, he wants to even reach back to biblical times, which makes his case even worse.
Yeah. So for listeners who might not be familiar, I've had Walter Bloch on this podcast. We had a debate, him and I, discussing the libertarian case for Israel. And he tried to make the case, and his argument was that, well, the Jewish people have lived in this land 2,000 years ago, so they have a property right claim on it, and therefore he specifically said all the property rights that existed pre-1948 are invalid, because 2,000 years ago this was the land of the Jewish people, and so anybody who was not Jewish in 1947, all their property rights are invalid. Now, I believe this is completely absurd, because first of all, let's look at, so there are many, many, many versions of Zionist explanations of this. The most common one is not as ridiculous and insane as the Walter Bloch view. The most common one says that there was nobody in the land, and that the land was just empty, and that Jewish immigrants came, bought the land, and then after they built the country, Arabs started fighting, demanding that land, weirdly enough. But of course, this is completely absurd. The land was very well settled. Only a third of the population in 1948 was Jewish. 2/3 was not Jewish. It was Christian and Palestinian, Christian or Muslim. And the 1/3 of the population in 1948, the majority of them had only arrived in the past 10 years. So in 1938, the vast majority of that 1/3 was not even there. But if you look at the ownership of land, and this is very well documented. So the idea that it was an empty land is ridiculous. This is very, very well documented. You see here, this plot, which you can see, shows you in each district how much land was owned. And this is United Nations studies. This is a study that was done by the United Nations. They had sent a team that they went to every district and looked at the land records, and they were able to calculate this. And you see, in every single district of Palestine, the land was predominantly owned by Muslims and Christians. Jews were a minority of the population, but they were also a much bigger minority of land ownership. Depends on how you estimate it, but it was around somewhere between 7 to 10% of the land was owned by Jews at that time. So before 1948, it was possible for Jews to own land in Palestine, and they owned something in the range of 7%, 8%. It depends exactly on how you define private land versus public lands. The most generous definition that you could come up with will come up with an estimate of about 12% land for Jews in 1948. But 88% or 93%, somewhere between 88 and 93% was owned by Muslims and Christians, and the Druze, the other minority. And you see this in every single district. So Jaffa is the one that had the biggest majority, or the biggest minority of land owned by Jews, because that's where Tel Aviv is. And that was 39% of the land was owned by Jews. Haifa was 35%. Tulkarem, where I'm from, was only 17%. And Nazareth, 28%. Acre, 10%. Safad, 10%. Tiberias was only 28%, and Bisan was 34%. So in the vast majority of the lands owned by Palestinian. Now, the Zionists either resort to the more common view, which you get in American conservative circles and in American Zionist circles in general. I shouldn't say conservative and liberal as well, which is that, well, there was nobody there, and, well, none of this stuff matters. You got to give Walter Bloch points for creativity, which is saying that, well, it doesn't matter if they were there, because 2,000 years earlier, the Jewish people had lived there. Now, this is particularly absurd because different definitions of different people have lived in different places at different times, and in nowhere else have I ever seen this idea that somebody could go to a piece of land and say, hey, I am part of this ancient people that used to live here thousands of years ago, and therefore your property rights are invalid, so get out of your homes, give me your homes, I need to move in. This doesn't happen anywhere. You can't go to, say, Sweden and say, hey, I'm a Viking, I'm the original Viking, and I want to be a Viking, and now I want to kick everybody who identifies as Swedish, I want to kick them out. And this, I think it's, you might say, well, no, that's not the same thing because the Swedish people are the Vikings. Well, the Palestinian people are the Canaanites and the Jews. Most likely, if you look at DNA studies, you see that the average Palestinian has got probably more Jewish DNA from the ancient DNA of Jews than the average European Zionist immigrant in 1940s who had come in and had a lot of European blood. So obviously, I don't believe land and property rights are determined by genetics. I'm just bringing this up to illustrate the absurdity of the Walter Block position.
In 1918, David Ben-Gurion, who would be the first prime minister of Israel, the later Israel, 30 years later, and Yitzhak Ben-Zvi, who would become the second president of Israel, the state of Israel later on, 48, or whenever he comes into office. He's not the first president. They wrote a book together. It's never been translated into English, as far as I can tell, where they argued that, and of course, Ben-Gurion was the leader, certainly one of the leaders of the international Zionist movement to establish a state in Israel. It's not some secret cabal. This is an open movement to create pressure for a state. He argued in that book that the Palestinians, in other words, first of all, acknowledging that there were Arabs in Palestine, so we'll call them Palestinians, whether or not they use that term, although that term does go back further than people think. He said those people are the descendants of the Judeans. He says that. Now, his strategy at that time might have been, let's win them over to our side. These are our brethren. That's how they talked. He drops that later on. Ben-Zvi, who actually had expertise in this area, Ben-Gurion wasn't particular at, descendants or, that kind of thing. That wasn't his field. He was a political activist mainly. But Ben-Zvi actually has some expertise in this, and I think Ben-Zvi maybe even wrote his own book later on this point. But they end up dropping that because it didn't go over, right? It wasn't convincing Arabs in Palestine to welcome Zionist takeover with open arms. So they said, okay, let's forget about that strategy. But it's very interesting that 1918, they say this, and you can find details about this book. It's untranslated, and I don't read Hebrew, but you can find it in Shlomo Sand's book, The Invention of the Jewish People. He's got quite a lot of detail there, so that's very interesting. Now, your point about 2,000 years ago, I think we can take even further, although, this will get me into trouble with some people. How did the forces under Joshua, this is right in the book of Joshua, how'd they get the land? They didn't buy it. They conquered it. They ethnically cleansed. Now, they might say, well, God told me to do it. Well, okay, you can believe that or not believe it. It's up to you. But there's no doubt in the scriptures, in the book of Joshua, which is part of the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, armies go in and conquer, and in many, many cases, they're ordered to kill everybody. Men, women, children, livestock, everything. And on occasion, they could keep the virgins who, if they were attracted to them and wanted to make them their wives. They're allowed to do that sometimes. This is orders from God, not just a suggestion, an order. And then occasionally when they let some people live, they got the forces that let a few people live caught hell for it. What do you mean you didn't kill everybody? We told you to kill everybody. So you can't argue the Bible. You can't argue the Bible. Maybe there ought to be a Canaanite liberation movement. Where are the Canaanites? They must be somewhere. Why can't they come back for their land? They outranked the PLO. They preceded the PLO, right? The CLO, the Canaanite Liberation Organization. Where are they? Nobody speaks for them. I'll speak for them.
Yeah, let's do that. Let's start Canaanite Liberation Front. I mean, I think that is obviously absurd. I don't mean that. I think the point here, the really important point, which I believe is just amazing how people miss this, which is that there's everywhere in the world has witnessed conflicts before, but everywhere in the world there is a system of property rights that is more or less accepted by pretty much everybody, with small minor disputes about various plots of land. And that was the case in Palestine in the 1940s. And that was the case since the 19th century. So the Ottoman Empire had control over the land. People had local autonomy. There was what was called the millet system, wherein every religious group had the right to live by its own law, to have its own courts, handle its own civic affairs. And everybody just paid a little bit of tax to the empire, to the Ottoman Empire. But under that system, you could own land regardless of what your religion was. And so everybody was able to own land. And so the notion that at some point Europeans get persecuted in Europe, and so therefore, you know what? No, 2,000 years of property rights in Palestine have been invalidated because we want to go back, is just completely absurd. There's no way to justify that. And I think another interesting point about this is that people will say this. You hear this common thing, which is that, well, the Jews had the land, then the Muslims came and took it over. And that's not correct, because the Muslims did not take over the land in the sense of what the Zionists did in the 20th century, which is let's ethnically cleanse the local population, or even let's force them to become Muslims. This is a very, very important and overlooked point, which is that when the Muslims took the land was under the rule of the Roman Empire at that time, the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire. And they had eradicated almost entirely the Jews from Jerusalem. There were still Jews in the rest of Palestine, in the north of Palestine, in the south of Palestine. But Jerusalem itself, you would get killed if you were a Jew and you were found in Palestine. So that was part of the takeover of the Romans, was that they destroyed the temple and they banned Jews from coming to Jerusalem. It was not possible for Jews to come to Jerusalem. And the residents of Jerusalem at that time were Christians. And a lot of them had converted to Christianity because they were Jews before, but they converted to Christianity so that they could stay where they were. Now, when the Arabs came, this is a very important point. The Arabs did not come in as a population. It was not an occupation wherein the Arabs came in, occupied the land, and kicked out the local residents and replaced them with Arabs. No, they kicked out the rulers and they ruled the land, but they did not kick out the residents. In fact, what they did was they, very famous in Islamic history, what the Umar, the Caliph at that time, what he did to the Christians was that he told the Christians that he was going to protect their souls, their money, and their shrines. He wouldn't touch any of their churches. He wouldn't destroy anything that they held sacred. And he let them continue to live where they were. But the one thing that he did that the Christians didn't like was that he let the Jews back into Jerusalem. That was after 500 years of exile. The first return to Jerusalem was under Omar. And in fact, there's a great book by an Israeli professor called Moshe Gil. It's called The History of Palestine, 634 to 1099. So this is the period from the Islamic conquest until the Crusades, so the period under Islamic rule. And it describes in details how the Muslims were the ones who brought the Jews back. Until then, the Jews were only able to go to Gaza. That was as far as they could go. The Jews from outside of Palestine would go to Gaza and pray to the temple from Gaza, because that was as close as they could go. If they went any further, closer to that, the Romans would kill them. And or from Tiberias in the north. If they were coming from the north, they'd go to Tiberias and they'd pray toward the temple in the south. Then Omar came in with an Arab Jew who had converted to Islam, but who was familiar with the Judaic importance of the temple. And they brought in people who were Jewish from the surrounding areas, and they discovered where the temple was. They cleaned it because the Byzantines had turned it into a trash heap. They turned it into the garbage dump deliberately because they didn't want it to remain a holy site. But the Muslims cleaned it, renovated it, and allowed the Jews to go back to pray there. And since then, there has been continuous presence of Jews in the land. So in the mind of the average American Zionist propaganda consumer, this is a game of cat and mouse. It's almost like a Tom and Jerry cartoon where it's, the Muslims took it and then the Jews took it and then the Muslims took it and then the Jews took it. It's not like that. It absolutely is not. There were all these people who were there up until 2000, and then the Jews were eradicated by the Romans, not by the Muslims. And then it was the Muslims who returned, who kicked out the Romans, and the Muslims were the ones who allowed the Jews back into Jerusalem. And since then, they had coexisted, Muslims, Christians, and Jews in that land. And I think the important point, which, as you mentioned, Ben Gurion mentions, is that the local Palestinian population of today, people like me, are most likely descended from the ancient Jewish population that was existing there. Not just the Jews, but also the Canaanites. And the Jews themselves were part of the Canaanites. But so the people who lived in that land more or less have stayed in that land, and they've converted to Islam. Many of them converted to Christianity when Christianity came about, but genetics have not shifted significantly.
According to Sand, and maybe you can tell me whether you agree with this or not, once the Muslims came to Palestine, one inducement they offered to people who would convert is freedom from taxes. And so Sand says a lot of people who might have been Jewish became Christian maybe, or didn't become Christian, went over to just to save the money, and went over and became Muslims. So there's, that's one possibility. Another thing Sand points out very emphatically is the Romans we're talking about the year 70 now, right? 70 of the Common Era. The Romans did not exile or expel. You said from Jerusalem, that's fine, but they did not wholesale exile all the Judeans, all the Jews from Palestine or from Judea. In fact, he says there's no book, there's not a single serious historical work on this. There are no Roman records that have ever been found, and the Romans kept records. These great empires always kept records of things. And that's not what the Romans did normally. They might have shipped out the leaders of the revolt because you want to get rid of the revolutionaries. That's just something politicians do, the troublemakers. But they needed the peasants, the farmers, the taxpayers. They didn't carry everybody out. They didn't even have the means to carry everybody out. And so there was no dispersion. The general story is they got kicked out of Rome, they got kicked out of Judea or Israel, and now you get the wandering Jews scattering everywhere, and that's where you get the Ashkenazi Jews. And Sand is presenting a contrary theory that they didn't get kicked out, but he still has to answer the question, where do all the Ashkenazi Jews come from? And there have been a lot of conversions, which he documents over many years. There was a time when Judaism was a proselytizing religion, certainly before Christianity became really big and became the official religion of the Roman Empire. There were many conversions in like Yemen, the Yemen area, the Iraq area, and other places, Northern Africa. And then in the 8th century, one possible theory, may not be absolute proof of this, of course, is the kingdom of Khazaria between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, where the king decides to become Jewish because he's caught between the Muslim on one side and the Byzantine on the other side. He says, okay, I don't want to offend either one. We'll be Jewish. And then, of course, in a couple centuries later, like the 11th century, they get driven out by the Mongols or whoever, and they end up moving west. And that's where you get this big population explosion of Jews in Europe, further west. I mean, that's a coherent theory. And there's been a lot written about it, right? In the 1970s, Arthur Kessler wrote a book called The 13th Tribe, which was about Khazaria. Most Ashkenazi Jews may not even be able to trace genetic roots back to the so-called Promised Land. But I agree with you; it's not relevant anyway.
Yeah, and I agree it's not relevant anyway, although I think Shlomo Sands takes it a little too far, because I think modern genetic analysis, DNA analysis, we keep getting more and more samples, and we keep getting more and more old bodies dug up, and they do genetic analysis of these old bodies. And it does seem like for the Ashkenazi population, there is a link. They do descend, they do have some origin from that land. So it does seem that this idea that the Khazarians had just converted to Judaism and had no relation to the Jews of Palestine. It seems like it is a little bit exaggerated. They still carry some of the genetic material of the original inhabitants of Palestine. And also, I think the other thing that might undermine Shlomo Sands' thesis is that, well, the Jews of the Orient, the Jews of the Iraqi Jews, the Yemeni Jews, Egyptian Jews, they seem to have even more of that. So, yeah, they did not, the Jews that did not descend from the Ashkenazi Khazarian origin, they seem to have a lot of DNA material from the Jews of Palestine in the era of the before the Roman conquest. So it does seem like there is that link, but it does look like, the average Palestinian, particularly Palestinian Christians, because Palestinian Christians did not intermarry with the Muslims and Muslim Arabs. So there's some. So if you look at the average DNA of the Palestinians, you see that the Christians are the ones that are the Christian Palestinians are the ones that are the closest to the original Canaanites. The Muslim Palestinians, they do have some European ancestry. They do they have some Arab ancestry primarily. They're similar to the Christians. They have the local DNA, but they also have a little bit of Arab DNA. They have a little bit of African DNA, and they have a little bit of European DNA. The Arab DNA is from the Muslim conquest because some Arabs did come. It wasn't a wholesale population transfer, but there was some population and migration at that time. And if you became a Muslim in Palestine, you intermarried with the Arabs. And so the Arab DNA is in the population. So there were some Africans who also came in and some Europeans who came in through all kinds of historical situations, some slaves and some conquerors and some crusaders. So you see this kind of intermixing, whereas the Christians didn't marry and intermix with these populations, so they kept that DNA. So if you were going to be going by racial theories, if you wanted to follow the Walter Block insane theory of no, my people were here, everybody has to leave but the Palestinian Christians. They get to keep the land because they are the ones that are pure real. But this is, of course, insane.
As the Jewish anti-Zionists, and there's still Jewish anti-Zionists around today. There's the American Council for Judaism, which is an old group set up in the 40s to oppose the formation of the State of Israel, and that's a Reform Jewish. Rather, the Orthodox had their own reasons against it, but the Reform used to say, there's not a Jewish people. There's Jewish peoples of many ethnicities, of many, if you want to call them races, of skin tones, of languages. There's not a single Jewish people, and they may have religious beliefs and practices in common, but nothing else. They don't even speak a common language. They didn't speak the same language. If Hebrew is the language of Israel, it's not the Jewish language. Most Jews around the world don't speak Hebrew. They don't speak Yiddish either. Yiddish is from Eastern Europe, particular time and place. So, there's all this point. The Reform insists Judaism is a religious community. It's a religion, and many communities around the world practice and believe in that religion. But to say there's like one community or one group, and especially to harden it into a biological group, a genetic group, makes no sense. But the Israelis are pushed to do that because number one, they want to be, at least they have been up until recently, wanted to be secular because they didn't make it a theocratic state. When they called it a Jewish state, that didn't mean a theocracy, because the founders were secular, for one thing. Herzl had a Christmas tree. Ben-Gurion was not a believer. So now they're becoming more religious in recent years. So that changes. But so it wasn't Jewish in that sense. So what sense is there? They're driven toward a genetic explanation. Because if you say, well, we don't mean Jewish in the sense of, you don't even have to believe in God, right? Look, my mother was Jewish. I don't believe in God. I could become a citizen tomorrow, right? I could get on a plane and become a citizen and have all the privileges of Jewish, not just citizenship, but Jewish nationality. It's nationality that counts.
You could have my grandfather's land.
Yeah. So you can't do that, but I can do it. And I'm not a believer. I don't do anything. I have a Jewish mother. That's it. That's genetic.
Yeah.
And yet the genetic kind of falls apart. So it's a mess. It's a real mess. And it doesn't, that genie's out of the bottle. It can't be put back in. We have to now deal with terrible things that are going on. And I wish I had an answer to that, but I don't. So I take refuge in history, where I'm safer.
The syllabus for my new online economics course, Principles of Economics, is now available on Saifedean.com. The course will take place over 18 lectures, each based on one chapter from my new book, Principles of Economics, which will be available for free as an ebook for everyone registering for the course. Lectures will be released once every 2 weeks on Mondays, starting on the 25th of September 2023, and will be available in video and audio format. Live discussion seminars will be held once a week on Thursdays at alternating time slots, 12 hours apart, to ensure learners can attend from all over the world. I'm happy to announce that I have set up my new publishing house and online bookstore, The Safe House, which will be publishing and delivering the best Bitcoin and Austrian economics books worldwide in hardcover, audiobook, and ebook formats. Go to thesafehouse.com to buy my latest book, Principles of Economics, as well as the Fiat Standard and the Bitcoin Standard. And now I'm also publishing Fiat Food, Matthew Lysiak's amazing investigation into how inflation ruined our diet and health. And I'm also publishing Lynn Alden's Broken Money, her masterful exploration of the failures of the global financial system and how Bitcoin fixes it. This is a Bitcoiner's bookshop, so the books are printed in beautiful cloth hardcover made to last, with an ice-colored dust jacket on top. Go to thesafehouse.com and get yours now. The truth is very, very important on any issue, and it's always tempting when things are getting ugly, particularly in times like now. It's always tempting to just go along with what's going on and just accept what is being imposed on the world in fiat, essentially, which is, look, this is the reality, this is the guns, but I think the truth still matters, and I think the truth is essential. And the truth of the matter is, if you understand property rights, I think you get a very good understanding of why this is such a massive conflict and what the problem is. And the problem ultimately comes to the fact of the abuse of property rights. That's what it really is. So in 1947, anybody could own land in Palestine, and it didn't matter what your religion was. And then in 1948, the Zionist movement ethnically cleansed Palestinians who were not Jewish, kicked them out of their homes simply for not being Jews. And they had an astonishingly powerful military at that time, which was funded and armed by rich Europeans and by Soviets and leftists and the Czechoslovaks and the Soviet military. So they had a lot of weapons, they had a lot of arms, whereas the Palestinian population were practically disarmed because in 1936 and 1939, the British regime had disarmed the Palestinians and left them essentially helpless and defenseless. And this, for me, is the origin. If you're really wondering why this is the case, it's not because of anti-Semitism. It's not because Palestinians decided coincidentally and conveniently enough to start hating Jews in 1948 after centuries of having lived with Jews in Palestine. It's because in 1948, the property rights of Palestinians were violated. This is what it comes down to. So 90% of the land of Palestine was owned by people who weren't Jewish. The majority of them lost their land in 1948, and they were left with nothing but the land that was remaining in the West Bank in Gaza, which was then taken over in 1967. And then settlements took over most of the land in the West Bank, or well, not most of the land, but it's taken up massive portions of the land in West Bank. And since then, Israel has very systematically gone about dispossessing Palestinians. This is the thing that you don't hear about if you get the Zionist idiotic propaganda version of the conflict in American media, which is that it's been very systematic from 1947. It's always operated on the one slogan, which is more land, fewer Arabs. And so this was what drove the ethnic cleansing in 1947 and 48. And this was what drove the policies of the Israeli occupation from 1967 onwards, particularly in the West Bank, wherein they've destroyed, the Israeli Committee on Housing Against Housing Demolitions has calculated that I think it's around 140,000 houses, 140,000 Palestinian houses have been destroyed by Israel. And that's not counting the recent Gaza war, which has destroyed hundreds of thousands of houses in the last 3 months. But even before that, we'd already been up at 140,000 houses destroyed. And these were destroyed sometimes with vague excuses, sometimes just through dispossession. We're going to take this land and we're going to build on it, and we're going to kick you out and your family out, and we're going to take it away. This happened in 1948 land. This happened to villages in Palestine, Christian and Muslim villages that had been destroyed and depopulated, and whose people are not allowed to go back to it because the land was taken over by the Israel Land Authority. And it happens in 1967. That's how settlements get built. Palestinians' land gets confiscated for roads, for infrastructure, and for settlements. And then it's a very, very perverse cycle wherein, well, we need to build a road here so that we can connect to that settlement. And then, well, we need to have cell phone tower on this road so that the settlers driving on this road can get cell phone reception. So we need to build a cell phone tower. Well, now that we have a cell phone tower, we need a house for somebody to take care of the tower. And then that grows into a community, and they keep confiscating more and more land for the road and then for the settlement. And then the settlement needs more roads, so they keep confiscating more and more land. And that's how we end up with almost 1 million Jewish settlers in the West Bank today, in land that had belonged to Palestinians.
Yeah. I want to take it back a little bit earlier, and not to ancient time, because this is not really an ancient conflict. I mean, you and I agree on that. There's interesting history back then, and you went through a lot of it. But this is not an old conflict. This is, a little more than 100 years old. So it's not that old in the scheme of things. If you go back to the earlier 19th century, 20th century. Not talking about the 19th century. You could go back there too, but land was being purchased from absentee landlords, feudal landlords that had been given tracts of land by the Turks when the Turks still ruled the area. And also there was some registry of individual property was registered with bigger landowners as a way to maybe making the taxes easier on the little landowner, right? Because the big guy had connections. And they were often living outside of Palestine altogether. They lived in Beirut or other places. You had feudal landlords. And so some land was being purchased among the 6 or 7% you talked about, was being purchased from big landlords outside of the country, but that land had been worked for generations and also lived on for generations by Palestinian Arab families. And I say Palestinian Arab because in those days the Jews were called Palestinian Jews, right? The Jerusalem Post was called the Palestine Post. So you had to distinguish if you wanted to make that distinction. So the Arabs who had lived and worked there, the Palestinians who had lived and worked in those lands for, their families had for generations, got kicked off because there was a boycott of non-Jewish labor. The land was being redeemed. That's what the Zionists used to say. It was Jewish land now coming back into Jewish possession, and we should only employ Jews. So people who had lived, who worked there, who lived there, their fathers did, their grandfathers did, etc., back to 1,000 years maybe, are suddenly kicked off and can't even be hired there. That created a lot of resentment. So you do get violence of Arab Palestinians against Jews in the 20s and 30s. And I don't want to defend, I would never defend indiscriminate violence. But it was at least understandable, not excusable, but understandable, because of the change that was going on at the hands of the Zionist movement, which was an organized movement to create a state in as much of that land as possible, all of it preferably of Palestine, but as much as possible.
Yeah, and I think there's a little bit of an overemphasis on this part of the conflict on the part of Zionists, because it's a better story than the idea that they stole the majority of the land. But the reality is, even with all of these absentee landlords and the people who were, it's important to remember at that point, people had lived in Palestine, Lebanon, and Syria, and Egypt interchangeably. The families would be extended across these borders. These borders didn't exist. It was perfectly natural and normal for a family to be based in Beirut and Jerusalem and Jaffa, and to have land in Lebanon and in Palestine and in Syria. And so it's perfectly normal that there'd be absentee landlords because there were no borders before these landlords. But still, even with all of these controversies around these particular plots of land where the tenants of the land were practically landowners, but they were legally tenants. And then when the owners sold the land, the Zionists kicked out the Palestinians who were in the land. Still, even if you concede all of that land belongs legitimately to Zionists and the Palestinians have no claim to that land, that all adds up to 10% of the land. There's still 90% of the land that's not owned by the Zionist movement. And since then, another very important point to keep in mind here is that this isn't just ancient history because, all right, well, just get over it. There's been a lot of people who lost a lot of land in a lot of places all throughout history. Just get over it. You look at the European history, you see many examples of countries and people who had lost land. But in this situation, the difference was that even for the Palestinians who remained in Palestine, who remained under Israeli rule, they cannot go back to their own land in Israel, and they cannot buy it. And so there are a lot of villages that are just destroyed, and the population lives in refugee camps or in small other towns or in the cities, also within Israel proper 1948 territory, and they can't buy back their land. They can't move to the land. They can't buy it back because the land's been all taken over by the Israel Land Authority. This is the key issue that continues to this day, and why this isn't just historical grievances and people refusing to get over things. Because if Palestinians had the ability to just purchase that land back, and forget about getting it for free. If they could just have the ability to purchase it back and then move into it, then that would take away a big part of the grievances that they have. It would essentially diffuse the majority of the problems. But the problem is that they can't own it. The land, almost 90% of Israeli land, meaning 1948 land, the area that was occupied in 1948, 90% of that land is owned by the Israeli Land Authority. And it is not available for sale for anybody. Nobody can go buy it from the Israel Land Authority. The Israel Land Authority just acquires land through conquest, through theft, through purchases, whatever it is. They acquire land and they just keep it. They hodl like Bitcoiners. They just keep the land. They don't ever sell it. They don't sell it to anybody. And they allocate it to Jews who come from anywhere in the world. So anybody from anywhere can claim to be a Jew and could get that land. You could be Argentinian, never having set foot in Palestine, and no genetic link to Palestine, even going back to 2,000 years. And if you just claim to be Jewish, you could go back to Palestine. You could go, not back, you could go to Palestine, and you could be able to lease some of that land from the Israel Land Authority, land that was owned by Palestinians. This is what keeps the conflict running. As a libertarian, this is how I understand it. And it's why it's not something that I think can just be forgotten, because look, there are still 7 million Palestinians under Israeli rule, whether it's in Palestine proper, 1948, or in West Bank or in Gaza. And these people continue to be unable to own land and have property rights in their land because Israel has a communist system of land ownership. And that's something that I brought up in the discussion with Walter Block. And I asked him, well, would you support the privatization of land in Palestine? And being a communist socialist statist, of course, Walter Block, he pretends to be a libertarian on all kinds of things like roads and so on. But when it came to this, no, he does not support the privatization of that land. For him, he wants the state agency to continue to own it because he is a hypocrite.
Well, because the dilemma is, if it's going to be a Jewish state, unless that's to have no meaning whatever, they're going to have to be government interventions, or through a quasi-government organization like, as you point out, the Land Authority, to engineer the society. So Palestinians, again, living inside the 48 borders, have a terrible time, and maybe it's impossible to get permits for expanding homes, to building new homes, to building new villages. There hasn't been a new village, I don't think, allowed but it's got to be, you need permits. And when they build without permits illegally, they get demolished. That's not just happening on the West Bank. That happens within what's called the Green Line, right? The 1949 armistice lines. Otherwise, what does it mean to be a Jewish state? If they just wanted to say, look, we're going to be a totally libertarian area, we're going to call it a Jewish state, but otherwise it's totally libertarian. Well, we might quibble over the title, but it wouldn't be affecting people's rights, right? That have the, like you say, right to own land and to engage in all kinds of peaceful transactions. We could fight about what they call it. That's kind of very secondary. No one would be dying, but that's not what it means. It's what B'Tselem, which is the big human rights organization in Israel, but also Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, called Jewish supremacy. It's a Jewish supremacist state. Also, they also call it an apartheid state. You know, the problem is, and there's a very nice quote from Ilan Pappé, who's a Israeli, Jewish Israeli, maybe secular, but Jewish Israeli historian, is taught in England now for a long time. But I watched a documentary about the village of Tantura, which was a massacre of Palestinians in a coastal village after the Declaration of Independence. So, after May of 15th, 1948, not long after, I think late May. And Pape says, there's a problem with the Zionist project. European Jews had a terrible time in many periods and in many places. It wasn't uniform throughout Europe. There were better parts of Europe and worse parts of Europe, better times, worse times, but a terrible time. Pogroms, not even counting the Nazis, before the Nazis, but then the Nazis. So he says, so the view was we need a safe haven. But as Pape puts it, you can't create a safe haven by creating a catastrophe for other people. That's the bottom line. Now, I don't know what the answer is. I don't know what the answer was back, decades ago, if I were around and people asked me. And I certainly don't have an idea today about what to happen to bring an end to all the bloodshed and the violation of rights. But that's something that has to be grappled with. People who did not commit the crimes of Europe were made to pay the price for them. And that doesn't seem right to me. And when back, in the early days when people said it's a land without a people for a people without a land, which I think actually that phrase was originated by British Christians, rabbis went and visited and cabled back. It's like to Herzl, you're right, it's a beautiful bride, but she's married. I mean, they immediately said, it's not a people. It's not a land without a people. I mean, that was quashed the moment it came out of somebody's mouth. And so,
yes,
you get the story out, and I give you great credit for getting the story out, the right story.
Yeah, this is a famous phrase. The bride is beautiful, but she is married to another man. There's a Wikipedia page for it. It's a phrase used to refer to a fundamental problem confronting Zionist ambitions to found a Jewish homeland in Palestine. The phrase is of unknown origin, apparently they say here but it is known origin. I think it was, as you mentioned, it was a bunch of rabbis who mentioned it.
That's the way I heard it, yes.
Yeah, as 1890s fact-finding message in University of Oxford, Avi Schleim's The Iron Wall.
Yeah, Schleim's very good.
Yeah, Schleim's book, The Iron Wall.
When Herzl wanted to run his first Zionist Congress it would have been in 1897, it was scheduled for Munich. But of course, anybody who knows the history knows it wasn't held in Munich, it was held in Basel. Why is that? The rabbis wouldn't permit it to be in Munich.
Yes.
I don't know, they might have even called in the city authorities. I don't know if they did that or not. Yep. That would have been un-libertarian, but leave that aside. They said, no, we don't want this here. We don't believe this. It
was in 1904, though.
It's a secular group. It's not real Judaism, and stay out of our town. So they went to Switzerland.
Yeah. Absolutely. This is and when it happened, there was an enormous amount of denunciation of the Zionist movement from most Jewish organizations around the world. American Jews and European Jews and Palestinian Jews had opposed this idea because we don't want this. And it's very well worth noting that Herzl and the initial Zionists were anything but religious. In fact, Zionism was Herzl's plan B. I was reading, I read Herzl's diaries a long time ago when I was in college, and his plan A was mass conversion. He wanted to convince the rabbis, to convince the Jewish people to just convert to Christianity. And My first exposure to real anti-Semitism was from reading Herzl. I remember it because he was a very, very serious anti-Semite. He went along with the idea that maybe we could become Christians, and then he comes to the conclusion that no, we can never be Christians. We will never fit in with the Europeans, and we just have to leave.
Yeah.
We are cursed to not be part of those people.
And he says in this political effort now to form the new state, the Jewish state, as he called it, the anti-Semites will be our best friend. He says that in his diary that's been published for a long time. He appealed to the European leaders, saying, especially the anti-Semites, we agree with you. We are foreigners. We will never be at home here. I mean, he fed anti-Semitism. Who knows what would have happened later in the century had you had not decades, later in the 20th century, if you had not decades of the Zionist leaders saying, we don't belong here. Help us get out of here. And I can imagine an anti-Semite saying, yeah, okay, I'm a Zionist. I'll help you pack your bags.
Yeah, and in fact, that was one of the main motivations for the British support for the Zionist movement, because they saw all these Eastern European Jews being expelled out of Eastern Europe, leaving Eastern Europe, and they were worried that they would come to Britain, and they were very anti-Semitic, and they did not want them to Britain. So they do not want them to come to Britain, so Palestine was a good solution for them. And that's why they supported the Zionist project. The anti-Semitism and Zionism are two faces of the same coin. For many anti-Semites in European countries, there is a Jewish problem, and the answer to it is Palestine. And the answer to it is Zionism.
Right, and the reason I read the Popeye quote is because, look, there was a problem that Jews needed to solve one way or another. Come to the United States. There's already a reform movement here that said we do not regard ourselves as diaspora. We love, America is our Palestine. That's what they used to say. This is our Jerusalem. We don't look to reform, reconstitute the ancient kingdom and live under the laws of Aaron. They rejected all of that. This is the reform movement. It's in their 1885 declaration. I think it's the Cincinnati Declaration. They said that's from 2,000 years ago. That's got nothing to do with today. They tried to convince Jews not to become Zionists. And, the way Zionism really prospered was, they actually should be thankful to the Nazis, because with the Nazis, horrible, obviously one of the most horrible chapters in human history, they changed the mission, right? It became now a refugee mission, a place, at least that's how it was sold, a place for the displaced persons. But before the Nazis, that's not what it was about. They wanted all Jews, no matter how well off they were in America or anywhere else, to come to the new state of Israel. It was an ingathering of exiles. They were able to repackage it because of the horrors of the Nazis. And the Zionist movement during the war and during the 30s was disgraceful, because they didn't like any program that included a place for Jews to go in escaping Europe other than Palestine. Ben-Gurion and those people were not interested in the plan to get Jews to America, Australia, Canada, England, because that would take the pressure off the political movement, the Zionist political movement, if Jews had other places to go. And so they were against that stuff. I mean, that sounds pretty terrible. It seems like the first priority would be rescue them from Europe. I don't care where they go. Get them out of Europe because of Hitler. Instead, it's no, only get them out of Europe if they have that one place. Ben-Gurion says if it was a choice between getting all of the Jewish children of Europe to England or half of them to Palestine, I would not hesitate to take the second option.
Yes.
That's a horrible thing.
Yes.
That's a horrible thing. How come job one wasn't getting them to a safe place, even if its name wasn't Palestine?
Yes, I think this is absolutely a staggering reality of Zionism that most people don't realize today. Yitzhak Gruenbaum, another founding father of Israel, had once said one Jewish-owned cow in Palestine is worth more than all the Jews of Poland, when he was during the Holocaust, when that was the priority. So they could have worked on trying to make it easy for Jews to leave Europe to go to these places, but no, they wanted to make it difficult for them to go to the US. and to Australia and Canada in order for them to go to Israel. And so they were lobbying these governments to try and prevent them from going there so that they would put pressure on Britain to let them go to Palestine so that they could live there. And it's, and of course, most people don't know this, but there's something called the Havra Agreement, wherein the Zionist movement and Nazi Germany agreed to the fact that they have a very similar interest. And look, you don't want Jews in Europe. We don't want Jews in Europe either. So let's get the Jews out of Germany and send them to Palestine. And so there's a lot of, today, anybody who has any criticism of anything related to Israel is immediately branded a Nazi.
Exactly. But Eichmann was assigned to read the Jewish state by his boss, Adolf Eichmann, and he visited Palestine. And in the early stage, before the war, getting people out, expelling them was what was being done. That was the strategy, to get rid of them before the Nazi plans were Hitler's plans were fully formulated. He didn't begin day one knowing exactly what he wanted to do. And Eichmann was actually, I'm not making Eichmann out to be a good guy by any standard. He's a terrible man. But that was the strategy at first. That all, of course, that all changed. So there was a chance to get people out. There was foot dragging when it came to any plan that involved, even when they had the Evian conference in France. I'm not sure what year, I forget what year that happens, where the Western nations have a conference to talk about, okay, will any of these countries take Jews in? It's before the war, I guess. Take Jews in. I think it's before the war. And the Dominican Republic agrees to take 150,000. I don't think anyone else actually made any commitments. And there was pressure on the Dominican Republic to not do it because it would hurt fundraising for Palestine if there was another place to go. It would hurt the whole effort. I mean, that's disgraceful. I mean, that's like it's like a chapter that people know about, but nobody wants to talk about. At least older people know about it. Younger people don't because they've never heard it.
Yes, and of course, while we're at Zionist plans for migration of Jews to Palestine, there was also the sinking of the Struma, MV Struma, the disaster where the ship that was carrying Jewish refugees, and it seems like it was the Haganah who sabotaged it in order to sink it. Or maybe I'm mistaken. I'm getting it mixed up with something else. But there was a ship that was sunk by the Zionists because the British were not letting the Jews, we were trying to limit Jewish migration at that point. And so the Zionists sunk a boat in order to put the pressure on the, I'm not sure what the name of the boat is. Should have researched this earlier, but it hasn't occurred to me. But yeah, I mean, it's we see this pattern of with the Zionist movement that what matters is the success of Zionism, not the well-being of the Jews. And Jews are it's okay to sacrifice Jews in order if it makes Zionism succeed.
And also, why did Palestinian Arabs pay the price for what some evil Europeans did? I mean, there's the big question that just hangs there in the air, begging for an answer.
Yes, absolutely.
And, Netanyahu tried to come up with an answer. Well, the Mufti gave the idea of the Holocaust to Hitler. Remember, he tried that and immediately got laughed out of the room. There was no historical evidence of that. And the Mufti wasn't necessarily representative of the Palestinians anyway.
Yeah.
I think he was put into. So that's the question. I mean, like I said, I'm not saying I have all the answers. I don't, not by a long shot. But why have Palestinian Arab landowners, farmers, peasants, businessmen, there were all types of people, businessmen, publishers, there was an intelligentsia. Why did they get punished? It was like a ritual punishment, right, for crimes that they did not commit. And so the Europeans felt better by saying, we'll give Palestine to the Zionists. We'll feel better that way. We'll pat ourselves on the back, realizing they're not paying the price.
Yeah, that's what it comes down to. And I think, I mean, at a very basic level, this is almost childish, the degree of sociopathic carelessness about the fate of Palestinians, in a sense of, well, look, it wasn't your fault, but bad things happened to us. And I think, if you had a child that behaved in this way, then, well, somebody stole my bike, so I'm just going to go and steal somebody else's bike. And then if they're going to complain, I'm just going to kill them, because how dare you complain to me that I stole your bike when my bike was stolen? If you have a child like this, you should you should raise them very differently. You've done a very terrible way. You've raised them very terribly. That's not how ethics works. People are not responsible for the actions of others, and it takes an incredible amount of self-centered and self-indulgence and lack of self-control, lack of self-awareness to assume that the world needs to function in this way. Somebody took my bike, so somebody has to give me a bike, and I don't care if that means that I'm going to end up being a criminal like the guy who took my bike. I'm going to take somebody else's bike. It doesn't matter. I'm just going to do it because somebody took my bike. And it's that level of morality, because people just fail to understand what it is that Palestinians should be doing in this situation. It's if you want to drive a Zionist mad, just ask them that question. Well, what would you have done if you were a Palestinian? And the honest ones, Ehud Barak once answered that question honestly. It's just, a journalist asked him that.
Ben Gurion did. Ben Gurion told Nahum Goldman, who was president of the World Zionist Organization early on, and who wrote his memoirs, he quotes Ben Gurion saying, "If I were an Arab, I wouldn't negotiate with us either. We stole their country." That's verbatim.
Yes.
In Nahum Goldman, and look it up in his memoirs. 1962, I think they were published.
And Moshe Dayan also said something very similar. He said, look, yes, there's been Hitler and there's been a Holocaust, but that's not the fault of the Arabs. All they can see is that we took their land, and they're right. So we can't expect them to make peace with us. And of course, you would expect that this would be the kind of moment of awareness. Look, we shouldn't take other people's bikes just because somebody took our bike. But instead, it's this moment of belligerence of, look, we need to keep fighting them because they're right. They're going to keep coming after us, so we need to keep fighting them. Somebody recently asked it to Ehud Barak, and Ehud Barak said, yeah, if I was born a Palestinian, I'd join the resistance. But
in the 2000, remember the Camp David 2000, the famous Camp David stuff, Ben Ami, the foreign minister, says later on after that, I wouldn't have accepted that deal if I was a Palestinian. He was the foreign minister. He was there at the negotiations. Yeah. And yet that gets blamed on Arafat, who, I'm not a particular fan of Arafat, but that's been a raw deal. If you go back over history again, to return to like this broad sweep of history, on the whole, Jewish people had a better time living side by side with Muslims, and you got into this too, than with Christians. Look at Spain, and the glory of Moorish Spain, where Jews and Muslims live side by side. They may have been totally legally equal, so I'm not saying it was perfect, but it was everybody agrees that was a golden time when there was great advances in science and philosophy and all kinds of stuff. Shlomo Sand says that the Judeans, or the Jews in Palestine, welcomed when the Arabs came because they were having a very tough time with the Christians. The Muslims weren't calling Jews the killers of the Messiah. The Christians were, and they were killing Jews for doing that. Muslims didn't do that. And he even says that Jews joined the Muslim Arabs in conquering parts of northern Africa, and the Berbers, and they saw them as their brethren. So they even fought side by side against what they saw as a common enemy. So it's a much more complicated story than the news media gives you, and the pundits for the most part.
Well, it is in the interest of the Zionists to portray this as an intractable racial conflict that is going on forever, and that this land is just yo-yoing its way back and forth, and that, look, there's no right, there's no wrong, there's only might, and there's only you can have it now, and you can have it now, and now the Israelis have the power, so they get the land. It's not that. That's not the case. This conflict's origins really begin in the 1910s, in 1917 in particular. Before that, there was no issue. Before that, Jews had existed in Palestine. And to the extent that there was a Zionist movement before then, the vast majority of Zionists were spiritual Zionists or cultural Zionists. It was an idea that you want to go back to Palestine, maybe you visit Palestine, maybe you settle in Palestine. But it was out of the question that we would establish a nation state, which was something extremely un-Jewish, a very European idea, early 20th century, very fascist idea to build an ethno-state. The idea that you would do that in Palestine for Jews was completely out of the question for most of the Jews at that time. And it was really the Balfour Declaration that made this a serious problem. And it was then that this became a conflict. So this isn't an ancient conflict.
The cultural Zionists, and the name that comes to mind is like the leading cultural Zionist, was a pen name, Ahad Ha'am. Yep. He warned, and I published some of his quotes recently at the Libertarian Institute. He warned about this attitude toward the Arabs in Palestine. He warned about this. This is before 1900, and then he does it into the early 20th century. He's warning that political Zionism was mistreating and the Arabs in Palestinian Arabs, and disparaging them and treating them like they were these primitives who didn't know anything. It could be shoved aside and transferred, to use Herzl's words, right? Transfer. So there were people on the scene who were religiously Jewish saying, no, we can't do this. It's inconsistent. It's not a good idea on any grounds, but it's also inconsistent with their religious values, they said.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember reading your article on Ahad Ha'am. I think this was a much more common sentiment amongst European Jewry back at that point than Zionism. But then political Zionism took over, and I think Nazism is a big part of that. And sure. I think also socialism is a big part of that. There's a very strong socialist streak amongst Zionists could only see Zionism in a statist perspective. And I think this is the real catastrophe. Exactly.
That was the model. Collective living. You didn't even own anything. Why was anybody attracted to that?
Yeah, exactly. What this is, I think, in my mind, it's the leftism of the origins of Zionism that made it irreconcilable with the local population, because you couldn't just be a cultural Zionist. You couldn't just go move into a land and accept the fact that the people from other religions are going to be there. No, if you've caught the socialist brain damage of we need a state to organize everything, if you think in terms of the state needs to own the land, the state needs to organize production, the state needs to do this, and that, well, then, of course, the state is going to have the identity of the people. The state is going to have to impose the identity, and the state is going to have to get rid of anybody who doesn't believe in the God that we believe in the same way that we believe in that God, because that, it's the state. That's what the state does. It imposes things on people.
It certainly does, and it has been doing it for a very long time. I wish I knew what the answer was. I don't know even what to say. Not that anybody's hearing my voice over there, but I wouldn't know what to say to them. Either anybody, either side. I mean, this can't go on. We could be getting rich instead of fighting. That's what I'd want to say. You guys could be getting wealthy, trading and producing. Yeah. Instead of fighting and killing each other.
Yeah, I think there was, I would say that, when the 1990s, at the kind of end of history era, when people had imagined that the whole history had come to an end and democracy had triumphed, I think there was a period then when among Israeli society, there had been a kind of moderation of the worst elements of Zionism, of the most exclusionary, exclusive, supremacist elements of Zionism against the Palestinians, which really was envisioned by people like Rabin and Peres to some extent, in the sense of, well, we can maybe give the Palestinians the West Bank and Gaza, and then we'll be able to live in peace with them. And I don't believe that was a workable solution, because at that point, it was not workable because of the settlements. And I think for the kind of, liberal, cosmopolitan Zionists who cared more about Israel proper, they would have probably been willing to accept, let's just get rid of West Bank and Gaza and not have settlers there and let the Palestinians have it. And I think a majority of Palestinians would have probably taken that in the 1990s. And I think what derailed that was the extremist elements within the Zionist movement who continued to insist on settlements. I think settlements really were what derailed that. So Yeah, so when you look back, I mean, the obvious kind of moronic Zionist propaganda that the average American consumer of Zionist media gets is that the Israelis offered the Palestinians a state, and the Palestinians didn't want it because they just wanted to destroy Israel, and that's why the Israelis had no choice but to continue to occupy the West Bank and Gaza. But of course, that misses the fact that since 1967, Israel has been expanding settlements in the West Bank. And now we have almost 1 million settlers.
Ben Gurion warned against all that. He was more pragmatic.
Yeah.
Because he saw the problem. If you're going to keep a lot of Palestinian Arabs under your domain, what are you going to do? And so I think he favored, after the 67 war, he was not prime minister, of course, he was retired, but he was in favor of not holding on to those lands. And then my view also is, and I think this is a pretty common view, is hardliners encourage hardliners on the other side. They beget and encourage hardliners on the other side. So when people say, but Hamas, that's kind of the argument, right? But Hamas only arises in the late 80s after settlements are already going on and things are happening. And of course, encouragement of Israel, because they want, Hamas is religious. The PLO and Fatah are secular, and they wanted to divide the Palestinians by helping this religious organization rise up, which would some Palestinians would go from one group to the other because they were more religious minded, which would then, the whole strategy was to dilute, divide and rule the Palestinians by not having a single entity that the Palestinians would rally around. You had some with the PLO and some with Hamas. And Netanyahu, it's an open secret now that Netanyahu was encouraging Hamas, even as late as the Netanyahu years. So the hardliners, hardliners beget hardliners on the other side, and then they end up fostering each other, because one side says, well, look at their hardliners, we need a harder line, and the other side says, look at those hardliners, we need a harder line. And so the reasonable people are driven out. Oh, you're unrealistic. They're not going to go for your more moderate, realistic approach. And you can see how the more fair-minded people are driven out, and you don't even get the first steps toward some kind of settlement.
Yeah, that was the point that I'm trying to get at. That in the 1990s, there may have been a glimmer of hope in both camps, that the Palestinians were willing to maybe accept something like the West Bank and Gaza because, 40 years, 50 years of occupation and dispossession and refugee status and eternal victimhood is maybe enough. Maybe it's time for our kids to grow up in some semblance of normality. And maybe Israelis said, we don't want to be having to serve in the military all the time and have to fight wars all the time. But the settlements completely derailed that. And in fact, if you look at the extremists who really derailed it, I mean, the people who assassinated Yitzhak Rabin, they are the ones who are in charge of the Israeli government today. They are the allies of Netanyahu. Netanyahu was an extremist under Rabin's term, but today he is almost a moderate compared to the nut jobs that are in his government, like people like Ben Gvir and Smotrich. Ben Gvir himself, he used to make death threats to Rabin in the 1990s. And there's a very strong current now in Israeli politics that descends from that current, which completely refused any kind of settlement and just wanted to take on more land. And so it seems, unfortunately, that we're headed to this conflict continuing to aggravate. And, Smotrich himself, he said, the Palestinian Authority is a liability for us because they make the world see that, look, the Palestinians are civil, secular, they want the nation state, they want to live in peace. Hamas is an asset for us because Hamas shows the world that they are monsters and we can't live with them and we have no choice but to expel them. And that's just 2 days ago. He was saying we need to make sure that in the after-war scenario there's only 100 to 200,000 Palestinians left in Gaza, and then that will make the after-war scenario very very favorable for us. We can move in and we can settle in it. So it's tempting to think that, I guess the kind of overall message that I'm trying to get at here is that there's a solution. There was an idea of maybe could have some kind of two-state coexistence in the 1990s. That's gone. The settlements have completely destroyed any possibility of that happening. And now there's this kind of extremist Israeli element, an idea of, well, let's just kick them all out. And I think that's what they're doing. That's what they're doing in Gaza right now. The plan is to kick out the majority of people in Gaza. And then I think, it's very easy to imagine something like October 7 happening again in the West Bank, and then you kick out the Palestinians in the West Bank. But I think the dangerous thing here is that I don't think this is likely to work out. Well, maybe it does, but I mean, I think the dangerous part of it is that this kind of, once you've gotten into this mentality wherein there is no respect for others people's property rights because of your insane zealotry around your religious beliefs, wherein, look, it doesn't matter what those people think or own, or their lives don't matter because this is our land and God gave it to us. Well, they're not going to stop at Gaza and the West Bank. They are going to continue to expand. They're going to create more refugees, and then there's going to be problems, and then they're going to use that as a problem, as a rationale for further expansion. You can already see this within the settlers movement. I mean, they talk about the land of Israel is not just the modern day state of Israel. Lebanon, parts of Syria, parts of Jordan, parts of Egypt, parts of Iraq even. I mean, why not? Many people claim that the flag of Israel is the Nile to the Euphrates. Those are the two.
Well, the Bible says the Nile to the Euphrates in one of the places.
Yeah, so why would you expect?
These are religious fanatics. Yeah.
In fact, Smotrich himself, he's part of an organization. He was giving a speech with a map of Israel that included Jordan as well with Israel. So these kind of expansionist ideas, I don't think are going to stop with the West Bank and Gaza, unfortunately. So my very sad takeaway from this is that we could either have property rights independent of ethnicity, religion, wherein any person can own land, and then we can have a free market, and then we can have property rights, and then we can have peaceful coexistence, and we can have civilized society. Or we're going to continue with this insane, monstrous ideology of land is up for grabs and everything's up for conflict. And so if you say that might is right, then you're going to just be inviting people to fight back. If your logic for, hey, I'm going to take your bike because I'm stronger than you, well, you're just going to sign up for a lifetime of fighting over bikes. And this is the sad part about it, that I just...
Well, you create enemies. I mean, Netanyahu a few days ago published an op-ed where he said, 3 things may have to happen before all this will stop. Destroy Hamas, demilitarize the Gaza, and then here's the third one, which is it seems to me is impossible: de-radicalize all of Palestinian society, not just Gaza, but all. De-radicalize, that's a state of mind. What does that mean? The brainwashing? It sounds very Orwellian, or it sounds like Clockwork Orange, the novel and the movie Clockwork Orange, where they tried to wash something out of the guy's psyche. But this is a whole society. That means it won't end, because by their own goals can't be achieved. In fact, their own goals.
That's the point.
And the methods create new enemies, creates new radicals. It's a Hamas enlistment program to do this. The bombing. Look at the bombing. Look at the video of the bombing. It looks like Dresden, or it looks like Hiroshima after World War II. The buildings all smashed. It's unbelievable, those scenes. That's creating new members of Hamas, or maybe they'll call themselves by a different name, and pop up, a new organization will pop up. But that's not going to solve the problem.
Yeah, and I think this is it's very cynical, but it's a great recipe for making sure that you continue to be able to dispossess people and take their land. So if you need to de-radicalize Palestinians, and how do you even define that? There's always going to be a Palestinian who says something that you don't like, and therefore you can continue to launch war. And I think this is really what it's meant there. And of course, the Americans who cheer on this stuff are just completely oblivious to what this means. For them, it's that we just want to. If only Palestinians would want peace. Well, doesn't matter. Look at people in the West Bank. It doesn't matter how much of a peacenik you are. Your land is still getting stolen, and it's still getting given to settlers from Brooklyn who come in and just get this as an extra house given to them by the Israeli Land Authority because you get kicked out because you have the wrong religion. So as long as there's somebody who thinks something that Netanyahu doesn't like, then they have carte blanche to take out.
Well, don't get caught carrying a copy of Man, Economy, and State. You'll be accused of being radicalized by reading Murray Rothbard.
Yes, absolutely. He was a flaming anti-Zionist, wasn't he?
Well, but I'm talking about even his economics are radical. Free market radical economics.
Absolutely.
That's right. Or your book. That makes you a radical. If you read your book on economics, you're a radical. Has nothing to do with Zionism, but it has to do with property.
Exactly. Well, this is the real de-radicalization that needs to happen, if you ask me. People need to de-radicalize from the idea that land and property can be assigned based on 2,000-year-old stories or based on religious texts. No, property rights are individual. And if you're willing to accept other people have property right on a land, regardless of their God, regardless of their religion, regardless of what they believe, if you're able to accept their property rights, then you're able to live in peace. And this is kind of the conclusion of my book on economics, Principles of Economics. It's a long book, but it's all about property rights, and it explains all of the capitalist system and how the capitalist system functions, and it explains why it all rests on property rights. So if you have a society that accepts property rights, that accepts individuals have the right to their property, you have peace, and then you can have civilization. If you don't, you are just going to be signing up for a lifetime of conflict, unfortunately, and this is what we have, and it's depressing to see this. It's devastating. I grew up there, I have family there, and I just continue to see this, and it's extremely, extremely disheartening and depressing. Well, we do have some of the audience here. Does anybody here have a question? Ahmed had mentioned that it was the Patriot disaster was the sinking on 25 November by the Jewish paramilitary organization Haganah of a French-built ocean liner in the port of Haifa, killing 267 people and injuring 172. Yes, that was the Patriot disaster. That was the one, not the one that I mentioned earlier. Thank you, Ahmed, for mentioning that.
What year was that?
1940.
Okay.
Mask is asking, is the two-state solution viable? Why or why not? What do you think, Sheldon?
Well, I think you've already answered that. There are, 700,000 settlers now, or 500,000 to 700,000?
No, more than 800, close to 1 million.
So, and they expand them and build new ones, and they have this wall that snakes through a lot of it, which separates Palestinians' homes from their farmland, and a very big inconvenient thing. They didn't just build that wall on the old border between the West Bank and the 1948-49 Israel. Parts of it snakes through the West Bank and separates people, and there were Jewish-only roads that the Arabs can't use. So I don't see how you could do that. First of all, I think there'd be a civil war if Netanyahu or another prime minister said, "Okay, all you settlers, you got to move out. Move out. You get 30 days to get out. We're going to set up a second state." I think there'd be a civil war. So I don't see how that's going to happen. On the other hand, the one state, and this gets to the current controversy about is the slogan "from the river to the sea" an anti-Semitic slogan? Well, if it's anti-Semitic, then Likud is anti-Semitic because they say there should be Jewish sovereignty from the river to the sea. That's Netanyahu's political party. But I don't see how there can be one state because Israelis are not going to give up the idea of a Jewish state. The idea of the one state idea is, and it's supported by Israelis like Gideon Levy. I mean, these are outliers. Gideon Levy and Amira Haas and others. Everybody has the same rights, equal rights. Now, that doesn't address all the points you've been making about statism and socialism within the system. It doesn't call for reforming that, unfortunately, because those people are not laissez-faire advocates like you and I are. Safe. But still, they say, as far as they believe in rights, they think everybody should have the same rights from the river to the sea. But if you do that, it's not going to be what, quote, Jewish state. And so it seems to me the overwhelming majority of Israelis are not going to go for that. So one state's ruled out, two states are ruled out. I guess that leaves the no state solution, which is what we ultimately favor, right?
Yeah, absolutely. That's what I believe. The no state solution is really what the best. I'll take a one state solution as a compromise, but the two state solution is two states too many, if you ask me. And it's also completely unworkable. I think the fiction that there is a Palestinian state possible in the West Bank is just completely nonsensical. If you look at this, here's a map. First of all, 18% of the West Bank is administered by the Palestinian Authority. So the West Bank and Gaza together are about 22% of Palestine. And 18% of that is administered by the Palestinian Authority, is Area A. 22% is jointly Area B, and then 60% is Area C. So if you look at a map,
And A, B, and C are not like blocks on top of each other, right? A, B, C. It's all mingled together.
Exactly. And so if you look at this map, what you see is this.
It's ridiculous.
Yeah, and I think this is the thing that people don't get. People think, all right, well, maybe there's a bunch of settlers, and we could find a way around it. But this is what settlements have created. If you look at what has happened to Palestinian lands, Palestinians live mostly in this part that is Area A. Area A, this light blue part that you see here, which are these tiny little areas that are separate from one another. They are separate from one another. They're separated by walls and by Israeli checkpoints. So they're completely under Israeli surveillance. And there's no way of moving around between them except going through Israeli land and Israeli checkpoints. And this makes movement here between those towns and cities just completely unworkable for most people. It's enormously destructive of any kind of semblance of normalcy. You have all these lands that are being acquired by Israel. Israel's got all this orange area here that you see, which is the majority of the land, and they're building settlements on it. And it's impossible to have any kind of state for Palestinians on this land. If you look at it, here's another map from Wikipedia. As you can see, the blue areas are just constantly expanding, and most importantly, surrounding Palestinian areas. So you can't have a state over effectively what are 240 prisons. That's the best way to understand what the West Bank is. 240 prisons surrounded by Israelis. And the settlements are distributed all over the place, but not just distributed all over the place. The key thing to remember here is they are in the most of the strategic locations. They are on the hilltops. They are on top of all of the important water resources. So all of the water, not all, but increasingly more and more of the water resources are taken over by the settlements. They build the settlements over the water resources, and the Palestinians have no access to water, or very little access to water, and they have no freedom of movement amongst these areas. So the entire thing is just completely unworkable. And I think people like me used to sound crazy when we would say that the plan for Israelis is that they want to ethnically cleanse the Palestinians. But, sorry, this is the other map that I was showing. The plan for the Israelis is that they want to ethnically cleanse the Palestinians. But now it's really, it's this Gaza war is Israel's coming out of the closet party as we want to just get rid of them. And it's becoming very clear. This is what they're saying. People that are part of the ruling coalition in Israel are saying this about Gaza. It's only a matter of time before they say it about the West Bank. And, we're now at a point where some of the most important ministers in the government, the Minister of Finance, is saying this publicly. And won't be long before other people start saying it. It's very clear that they're going to start saying the same thing about the West Bank. And of course, the thing about propaganda is that most people think, well, no, we're not going to fall for that. They declare that they can't do it. But once something like October 7 happens, and there are so many questions about how that happened and how it was allowed to happen and how all the surveillance infrastructure that Israel has around Gaza failed at that time. But once it does happen, then once people have been manipulated into anger about it, then it doesn't matter. I mean, I know a lot of people that wouldn't think of themselves as being decent human beings who would never support kicking somebody out of their home because of their religion. Now don't see anything wrong with Gaza with Israel doing what it's doing in Gaza, and they think, well, no, they're just going after Hamas, and it's just a coincidence that they happen to destroy every single building in the city, that they've destroyed every single piece of critical infrastructure, that they've turned the entire city into an unlivable hellscape. No, they're just going after Hamas. They don't, even though the government itself is saying, no, we want to make it unlivable, we're going to try and get other countries to take the Palestinians. They just refuse to see that this is what it is about, to get people out.
Well, I think there's sort of a 007 complex. There's a license to kill, except it's 001. No one else has the license, right? So there's no other 00s. Israel is the James Bond of nations. And I think what happened in Europe, of course, the Nazis, is part of the reason for feeling that. I think even according to Gideon Levy, Golda Meir, who was a former prime minister, said, because of that, we can do anything. All is permissible now. So it is like a 007 license to kill attitude. And you can see it in action. I mean, every day you look at the headlines, look at the video from Gaza. Is it ever going to end? The only way it's going to end is when everybody leaves or everybody's dead. All the Palestinians. I mean, I don't see how it's going to end before that. If one person is alive, he could have a radical idea and immediately begin to tell other people about it. So I don't know what's going to happen. I just hope. Now we've had an attack on Beirut, right, where a top deputy in Hamas was killed, I guess by Israel. I'm not sure they've owned up to it, but who else would do it? Or the U.S. So now are things really going to spill over? I don't know if Hezbollah has responded. Is it now going to spill over? We're going to have a general war in the Middle East. Does the U.S. want to use it to go after Iran? Netanyahu has wanted to go after Iran. Trump wanted to go after Iran. You have the Houthis in the Red Sea, and the U.S. is shooting down drones. The U.S. has been, bombing places in Syria and Iraq, which it claims are Iranian related. Iran, gets the blame for everything. You don't need any evidence; just say Iran is behind it, and most people will go along. They don't even need to provide evidence. These are dark days. It's a heck of a way to start a new year, because it's a heck of a way to end the old year.
Indeed.
I hope you have a good New Year.
Thank you. Generally, as I said when I had Jeremy Hammond on, generally I try to, with every episode here, we have a constant running theme of Bitcoin fixes this. And we always try and see how Bitcoin fixes this. And
I don't know if Bitcoin get us out of this.
Yeah, I mean, theoretically, I can see the way that it fixes it. The entirety of. I think one point to get back to when we were discussing on the issue of land. See, for all of its bloodshed, Zionism has, by its own metrics, failed in the two most critical metrics that you could measure it at. And the first one is the majority of Jews do not live in Israel. So if you wanted to make a homeland for the Jews, you failed because the majority of Jews don't want to live in Israel, even though they can get free housing, effectively subsidized housing. So any Jew who's currently in France or America or Germany or Argentina or Uzbekistan, they're living there. They have to pay rent like anybody else in their home. They could just get on an airplane, go to Israel, and they'll have subsidized housing from the government. And yet a majority of the world's Jews don't move to Israel. So that's, I think, very telling. And secondly, a majority or close to a majority of people who live in historical Palestine are not Jewish. So there's about 2 million Palestinians in Israel that are Israeli citizens because the ethnic cleansing of 1948 was not complete. And then there's about 2 million in Gaza, and there's about 3 million in the West Bank. There's about 7 million Jews and 7 million non-Jews.
It's even.
It's approximately even, and it's not clear how the numbers would go. It was tending toward the Palestinians until recently, but I think with the Gaza war, it might be different because of all the death and all the people that are going to be displaced and all the people that are going to be leaving. But it's still nowhere near a majority, nowhere near an overwhelming majority that is Jewish in the land of Palestine. And I think this is a very damning indictment of Zionism, because even with a government that receives hundreds of billions of dollars of support from the world's fiat printer, which is the United States government and the Federal Reserve, the US gives billions of dollars to Israel every year because they can print money. Even with all of these insane subsidies, you have still not managed to make Israel into the Jewish homeland, because the majority of Jews don't live there. And a majority of the people who live there are not Jewish.
And it's in that Popeye quote, Israel was sold to Jews and the world really, as the safe haven, the necessary safe haven. It's the least safe place. And there's been more out-migration in the last several years than in migration from Israel. And a popular destination for younger Israelis has been over the last, 10 years, I don't know if it's true at this moment, is Germany. So young Israelis are leaving Israel for lots of reasons, but a lot of it may just be, it's too tense here, too much strife. It could be war anytime. They're going to Germany, Berlin and Munich and places like that. Think of the irony of that. That's really weird. So I agree with you. It's been a failed project. And I keep thinking, what would the early Jewish anti-Zionists, and there's a long tradition, I've already talked about it, what would those guys be saying if they were alive today? I mean, I knew some of the later great ones. Rabbi Elmer Berger, for example, one of the founders of the American Council for Judaism, which still exists. You can find it online. Alan Brownfeld is the editor of its publication. Very good guy, very vocal guy. And Alfred Lilienthal, an American a Jew who was a devout anti-Zionist. Those guys are gone now. They died in old age, but they left behind lots of writings. You can find them in bookstores, used bookstores, online. You can find stuff. There's this tradition that almost, very few people know about. I mean, my own family doesn't know about it. My Orthodox grandfather was an anti-Zionist, but I was too young to know what he was talking about. But at our Passover dinner seders every year, you hold two, there's a line in the official book, which is called the Haggadah, where you say, in the spiritual sense, next year in Jerusalem. Yeah, that's the line. My grandfather would say, next year in Philadelphia. And we were already in Philadelphia. And even I didn't know what that meant. I was too young. And I wasn't asking questions back then. I wish I'd been more precocious. The family thought he must have been kidding. Oh, he's just too old. He doesn't want to travel. No. After the 67 war, he blamed the Israeli Jews for the strife over there. I heard him do it. I heard him tell my mother that. And my mother couldn't believe she was hearing this from him. He's an Orthodox Jew. He read the Talmud every day and prayed 3 times a day and knew the Torah back and forth. And she said, you ought to go and see what they've done. They've made the desert bloom. He said, I wouldn't set foot there. I would never go there. I'd love to have a conversation. He died a long time ago. I wish I had a conversation with him.
Yeah, no, I think, and it's still the anti-Zionist streak within Judaism is still alive. There are a lot of Zionists. There are a lot of anti-Zionist Jews, secular and religious. Among the Orthodox, there's a very strong streak, even in Israel as well. They don't mind living there as Jews, but they mind a Jewish state, and I think. I agree with that. I mind the Jewish state in Palestine for the same reason I would mind an Islamic state or a Christian state. I mean, I may not mind it if it was just Islamic or Christian or Jewish in terms of its insignia, but what matters for me ultimately is property rights. If it's an Islamic state or a Christian state and or a Jewish state and people can own land regardless of their religion, then I'm fine with it. Doesn't matter. Put whatever you want on the flag, call it whatever you want, sing whatever song you want when the football team goes to the pitch. None of that stuff matters. I'm happy to do any of that stuff as long as people can have property rights. That's what it comes down to. But to go back to trying to end on a positive note, I would say, so the point I was making is, Zionism has failed in its 2 objectives in terms of the fact that the majority of the residents of Palestine, historic Palestine, are not Jewish, or very close to a majority are not Jewish, and a majority of Jews are not in Palestine. And that is in spite of all of the artificial support that has supported this insane idea over the past century, with first the British government and then the American government, who had the world's most powerful money printers running at full speed to try and support this insanity and sending weapons to make it happen. And I think if you wanted to have some kind of optimistic outlook on this, you would say, well, hopefully maybe Bitcoin would take away that money printer, and then it would allow us to live a more natural order wherein people need to come to terms with the fact that, look, you can't just take people's land because you have a money printer and a story that is 2,000 years old backing you up. People who have property need to accept it. And I don't know if it's too late at this point. I don't know if there's a coming back from this, and I think I don't know if there's a peaceful way that we could come back to a peaceful coexistence, because I think the sad reality is that there's just been so much bad blood that it's difficult to see this resolve in any positive way.
I agree.
Especially over the last few months. I mean,
you can't put toothpaste back in the tube. There's a lot of blood feuds, and takes on a life of its own. You can't just getting the history right is important, just because you want to know the facts, but that doesn't necessarily tell you, okay, what do we do today or tomorrow?
Absolutely. Very sad to hear all of this.
I like what you're doing. I like what you're saying, and keep saying it.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sheldon. I really appreciate you for joining us today, and keep doing what you're doing. Thank you for all your work.
I will.
Cheers.
Cheers.